Good afternoon, and welcome to today's presentation from Concerned Lay Catholics in Canada. Our webinar today will be presented by Tom Urbaniak, and he will be speaking on the topic of Can Concerned Catholics Repair the Church? I'll now turn it over to Catherine Peed.
Thank you, Keith, and good afternoon, everyone. Nice to see some familiar faces and lots of new faces today. So welcome to everyone on behalf of Concerned Lay Catholics. This is our January webinar presentation. We have a series of webinars through the year between September and June, and we're really happy to be able to welcome you. And on behalf of the planning group, I thank you for your interest and your attendance today. Concerned Lay Catholics is an independent group which came together informally at first in 2018 in response to the scandal of clergy sexual abuse in our church. Since that time, we've come to understand more deeply the critical role that the laity can and must play in promoting healing and reconciliation for all individuals and groups who have been wounded by our church. We endeavor through our various programs and activities to help lay Catholics find their own voice and bring it forth in order to live out the laity's role of co-responsibility in our church. Our prayer continues to be for lay Catholics everywhere to come together, to learn together, to pray together, and to act together for healing, reconciliation, and transformation. In addition to our webinar series, our offerings include Walking with Survivors program, through which we create opportunities for genuine encounter between survivors of abuse by church leaders and concerned Catholics. Indigenous Voices, where we support efforts to advance truth and reconciliation and bring the voices of Indigenous Catholics into conversation with the people in the pews. And in the service of the call to create a synodal church rooted in Vatican II, last year we hosted 15 sessions with 8 different demographic groups, including 2S LGBTQ, racialized, Spanish-speaking, and older Catholics. This was held over a 5-month period, and we even held an interfaith session, which included Jewish, Muslim, Baha'i, as well as other Christian denominations. We produced a report on our synodal conversations, which we shared with the CCCB and the Vatican last June. Further conversations are planned for the continental stage and beyond. Please do explore our website, concernedlaycatholics.ca, and sign up on our contact page if you would like to receive our monthly newsletter, which highlights news and events and upcoming presentations. At CLC, we see ourselves as a positive, helpful movement in the Catholic Church in Canada, amplifying the very large and to date largely missing voice of the laity. And so we begin in prayer for the whole church and remembering especially our commitment to survivors to pray for them always. Creator God, source of all being, we place ourselves in your holy presence. We ask you to open our hearts and minds to each other and to what you're saying to us through this presentation today. Help us to embrace and further the synodal process by speaking and truly listening with honesty and humility and great love. May it bring hope and healing to our wounded church. We continue to pray for the victims and survivors of sexual abuse. May all who have been abused in any way by your church's ministers be respected and receive real justice and authentic reparation. May we be beacons of Christ's healing light and compassion to them, their families, and to all the world. Amen. I now invite my CLC colleague, Christine Way-Skinner, to read the land acknowledgement and CLC's statement of solidarity with survivors of clergy sexual abuse, after which Gary Warner, CLC chair, will introduce our guest speaker. Thank you again for coming to the presentation today.
Thank you, Kathy. We acknowledge that many of the lands we live, work, and meet on are the traditional territories of Indigenous peoples across this country. As settlers, it is our responsibility to learn about and acknowledge our colonial history and the ways in which we may continue to perpetuate it. As people of faith working for justice, we are called to discern how we are to respond to the calls to action of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and how we can support Indigenous peoples across this land we know as Canada. We stand in solidarity with all victims of clergy sexual abuse. We are moved by compassion to reflect deeply on the suffering of our wounded brothers and sisters and to pray for them always. We make a commitment to educate ourselves and others about the devastating impact of this scandal in our church. We promise to promote justice and healing for victims and their families and for all those injured by this betrayal of our deepest values. We commit ourselves to the transformation of church structures and clerical culture that put protecting the institution above justice for victims and accountability for offenders. We rely on God in all of this, asking that we may be sustained in this commitment that we have made.
It is my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Tom Urbaniak. We've been pursuing the theme of church renewal and lay co-responsibility in some of our CLC webinars over the past 2 years or so. Topics have included the role of the laity in healing the church with Sister Nuala Kenny on May the 15th, 2021. Looking to the laity, what lay women bring to ministry, a panel with Christine Way Skinner and Catherine Mulroney, moderated by Anne-Louise Mahoney in March 2022. A new expression of church, synodality, co-responsibility and structure by Dr. Tony Hanna in October 2022. Today's talk continues our reflection on that theme. Our speaker, Dr. Tom Urbaniak, brings his experience as a scholar and public commentator specialized in governance. As a committed Catholic, active in his local and regional Catholic communities, and as a leader and visionary who has served in many leadership roles on boards in the nonprofit sector, including as past national board chair of Faith and the Common Good. We are very privileged to have Tom as our speaker today. We look forward to hearing his insights as he addresses his subject, Can Concerned Catholics Repair the Church? A study of faith, governance, and accountability. Let us give a warm virtual welcome to our speaker, Dr. Tom Urbaniak.
Thank you very much, Gary. Thank you all. I'm humbled by your presence. I'm inspired by your presence, and I'm looking forward to your feedback and guidance as I share some aspects of my research and my own discernment. So I'm going to share a screen. My discipline is political science. I will say a little bit about how my discipline applies to this topic, and then I'll say a little bit about myself, about my local spiritual home and how that has shaped me and continues to shape me in significant ways. Political science is the methodical study of power, of governance, of leadership. It's the examination of how systems and structures relate to values, policies, decisions, and behaviors. And as a practicing Catholic and a political scientist, I am deeply concerned about my church's inability to reform its structures to deal with a wide range of abuses of power, abuses that directly oppose the mission of Christ. For several years, I have been working on an academic research project exploring how the tools of my discipline might aid with reform. This has resulted in papers, conference presentations, articles in the popular media, articles in a collected book of essays, but not yet a manuscript, as I had hoped when I embarked on this research project. As I still have many questions, I'm still sort of toying with many possibilities, and you'll get a sense of that in the discussion, in the presentation today. I have been shaped in many ways by my home faith community, which is St. Mary's Polish parish in Whitney Pier, Cape Breton, Diocese of Antigonish, the only Polish parish in Atlantic Canada, marking its 110th anniversary this year. Why would a church marking its 110th anniversary be raising its steeple in a recent photograph? Our church suffered a tragic fire during renovations in 2014 and was rebuilt with the support of wonderful people in the broader community, people of all faiths and cultures, a beautiful demonstration of solidarity for which we are ever grateful, and which has certainly helped in our own discernment as a community about what God is calling us to do in our community and our world. In addition to the fire and rebuilding, our parish has gone through a number of crises, and I continue to serve in various lay leadership capacities within the parish, including as chair of the parish council during the fire and rebuilding, and also during the previous closure crisis. Our parish was scheduled to close to be suppressed, the official canonical term, on July the 3rd, 2012. We succeeded in prayerfully and positively pushing back against that plan. We also had difficult discussions with the diocese around the parish resources and how those were transferred to the diocese to pay reparations to survivors of abuse, which had continued for decades, covered up for decades in our diocese. Our parish was eager to make a contribution to survivors, but reluctant to simply sign over property without changes in the diocese, changes that did not come, structural changes. So the parish did, of course, relinquish its savings, but there were differences with respect to the relinquishing of real estate. And indeed, the parish had to get a legal opinion about the applicability of a trust dating back to 1913. But I'd like to share something more positive about my parish and its role in the community. So last Sunday, the Bishop of Antigonish, Wayne Kirkpatrick, made his first visit to our parish. He was installed as bishop in 2020. And I was asked by fellow parishioners at the start of the Mass to share a few words of welcome and to try to summarize in about 3 minutes the essence of our local faith community, or at least some of the essence of our local faith community. And I'd like to share with you what I said last Sunday. Bogu niech będą dzięki. So that's the Polish phrase for thanks be to God. And it's a phrase we use a lot. And to Bishop Kirkpatrick, I said, Bogu niech będą dzięki for your presence. Please know that you are always warmly welcomed. We hope you feel good here and recharged here. When I was asked to give a few words of welcome and a few words about the parish, Bogu niech będą dzięki were words that immediately came to mind. Thanks be to God. It's how I feel about St. Mary's Polish parish. Bogu niech będą dzięki. I want to speak personally for a moment. I was embraced by St. Mary's as a newcomer to Cape Breton almost 19 years ago. It's hard to believe it's that long. I had just come here to take what was then supposed to be a temporary job at CBU after my studies at Western. I had no family here at the time. Well, actually, I did. Tell your mamusha not to worry, said fellow parishioners. You have lots of family here, us. Bogu niech będą dzięki for this warm, loving, generous faith community, which my 11-month-old son, Oliver Mikołaj, is now experiencing. Bogu niech będą dzięki, that he can hear the Polish language in church and experience the spiritually uplifting Polish prayers and hymns. Actually, he's sort of singing along already. Bogu niech będą dzięki, that thanks to St. Mary's, baby Oliver will know a warm, inclusive Polish Catholic spirituality, a unique dynamic spirituality that moves with the seasons and that uses rich symbols and actions and colors and mysticism and a deep devotion to Mary. A spirituality that is often tied closely to the land and God's bounty and hospitality, and that blesses and sanctifies all that is around us. Bogu niech będą dzięki, that he's part of a community with such a rich heritage and legacy of faith and service, almost 110 years, rooted in hardship and in the resilience of immigrants and refugees who built the original church with their hands, but then built a community and insisted that nobody be cast aside. A legacy so often shared with others in our time, here and now, through many events and creative projects, through the popular media. Bogu niech będą dzięki, that baby Oliver can be in a church rebuilt after the tragic fire of 2014, rebuilt with so much collective input, so much community spirit, so much loving care, and with little pieces, actual pieces or components of faith communities from far and wide incorporated into the design of this sacred space. Bogu niech będą dzięki, that he will see around him a community of people who are willing to go to the margins, to take risks, to joyfully live the gospel, whether it's with Howard House, our local halfway house, or helping to keep the community street nurse pilot project going, or food security efforts, or helping the Father Greg MacLeod House for students get off the ground, or the major efforts for Ukrainian humanitarian assistance during this terrible time, or convening the neighboring churches and mosque to work together to design a board game that raised money to build a house for Habitat for Humanity 1 block from the church in this neighborhood. So I hope and pray that this kind of living faith will rub off on baby Oliver and on all whom we encounter. And then I said, Bishop Wayne at the Opłatek potluck, for which he joined us later in the afternoon, you will see a space, a plate that is left empty. And in the Polish tradition, it symbolizes that we try to be ready for Christ to enter at any time in any form. And that could be in the form of a stranger in need. I have felt here that kind of solidarity and sincerity and spirituality. I hope you will too. And I said, Bishop Wayne, please consider yourself not only a guest among us, you are family. Bóg zapłać. God bless you. And actually, you will see a couple of images from the Opłatek potluck, the one in the top left and the one on the bottom left. And part of the Opłatek potluck, Opłatek is like the Polish Christmas wafer, which is used for everyone to exchange directly blessings with everyone else. And we also had the jasełka, which is sort of like a Polish spin on the Christmas story, a traditional spin on the Christmas story. And 38 members of our community, we're a relatively small community, but 38 members of our community had sung or spoken lines, some of them presenting in the Polish language for the first time. I think essentially what I was doing in the welcome was reflecting on our shared ministry as Catholics. And I like to reflect on Luke chapter 4. This is Jesus when he began his public ministry. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me because he has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim liberty to captives and recovering of sight to the blind, to set at liberty those who are oppressed. Institutionally, however, the structures of power, control, and denial sometimes make that ministry difficult. And that has been a part of my parish experience. Sometimes it feels like institutionally we are doing our best to keep the Holy Spirit out of the church. How can we breathe the Holy Spirit back into the church? And highlighting those key words again, like spirit, liberty, good news, setting the downtrodden free. In the images here, you see some very late harvested produce from our parish food garden. A recent community cafe we did with students doing wycinanki, Polish paper art, which they gave to which was made for homebound elders. How can we go more from the image you see here, and how can it sort of supplant to some extent the image you see here? Have we changed as a result of the abuse crises? In some ways. We have responsible ministry protocols in our diocese. We've had major compensation to victims and survivors, and still ongoing. The liquidation of assets of parishes, of course, has been a consequence of that. So on some level, it might feel like a new chapter. But I'm going to humbly submit to you that the abuse-enabling structures and toxic organizational culture largely remain. And these are a recipe for the continued abuse of power in various forms, unless we can somehow repair the church. We still see a system, a structure, a culture characterized by internal secrecy and virtually no role for the laity in screening or appointments. The concentration of power in a largely unaccountable clergy, including control over money and property. The same people who have control over the sacraments have, in theory at least, absolute control over the money and property. With perhaps some exceptions, we have really no systems of professional performance evaluations of clergy. Real problems with the workplace culture, lack of professionalism. Even if we can all sort of point to and appreciate many excellent clergy, holy, collegial, cooperative, collaborative, inspiring clergy, they too are burdened with a structure and a culture that usually does not provide systems of constructive feedback. No clear codes of conduct in most cases. Let's consider a recent case study. So we're not simply sort of reflecting on horrors of the past. We're reflecting on very recent problems, sometimes ongoing problems, enabled, made worse by the structures that are ours. So just ask you to make note of the 3 dates on the screen. And I'm going to stop the screen share for a moment and come back on camera and share with you an excerpt from a short column that I wrote in late 2020 in relation to this case study. The Archdiocese of Montreal released a 276-page report, only sparsely covered outside Quebec. I have read the report in full. Dated September 2nd, 2020, the report was not publicly released by church leaders for almost 3 months. Montreal's Archbishop had asked retired Quebec Superior Court Justice Pepita Capriolo to investigate how Father Brian Boucher, who is currently in prison, managed to become a priest despite red flags. Plus, how did Boucher get away with abusing and mistreating children and adults for years following his ordination in 1996? Capriolo's report found a litany of complaints to church authorities, particularly to Mancini, about Boucher's professional misconduct and about possible criminal behavior. Boucher was finally arrested in 2017. He was later convicted and sentenced to 8 years in prison for the sexual abuse of 2 children. Mancini first dealt with Boucher in 1995 when Mancini was the coordinator of the Ministry to Priests program of the Montreal Archdiocese. Mancini finally recommended, which was a crucial recommendation, that Boucher be ordained as a priest, despite many concerns and complaints about Boucher's past conduct, including conduct with children. In 1999, Mancini was promoted to Auxiliary Bishop of Montreal. He was responsible for the Archdiocese English-speaking section, where Boucher was. Capriolo's exhaustive report makes clear that as program coordinator and then as bishop, Mancini had detailed, direct, and real-time knowledge of repeated misconduct by Father Boucher. He was warned of the serious risk Boucher posed to other people. Mancini sought to shuffle Boucher to a different position after complaints from another priest about Boucher, including sexual advances toward an 18-year-old temporary resident from Mexico. The young man was staying in Boucher's home before literally fleeing from Boucher. Capriolo reports that the young man explained to Mancini what had happened, but soon after he returned to Mexico and the file disappeared. Having heard all this, Mancini arranged to post Boucher as chaplain to young adults at McGill University's Newman Center. Before long, lay staff pleaded with Bishop Mancini to have the belligerent Boucher removed. They became alarmed when Boucher kept showing up with a 14-year-old boy and spending time alone with him. Neighbors and a priest had already met with Mancini about concerns for the same teenager. Yet Mancini kept Boucher at the Newman Center. Later, one of the senior lay staff at the Newman resigned in fear after Boucher threatened her. Later still, a 19-year-old student met with Mancini to complain that Boucher, as chaplain, had made unwanted sexual advances toward him. Meanwhile, a distressed mother wrote to tell Mancini that she had learned Boucher was proposing a 2-week private camping trip on the Cabot Trail with her young son. Mancini wrote a note to file on January 16, 2003, stating that, quote, "The situation requires action in the form of psychological assessment and therapy in the hope that Father Brian Boucher can be helped," unquote. Observed Justice Capriolo. This was part of a troubling, quote, prioritization of helping Boucher rather than ensuring the safety of the people around him. Bishop Mancini arranged psychological treatment for Father Boucher at a facility for priests in Ontario. When Boucher returned, he was made a pastor, the sole authority in a small parish. His abusive behavior would continue. At almost the same time, Mancini was promoted again, this time to become Archbishop of Halifax. In 2016, Bishop Thomas Dowd, the first church leader who was determined to report Boucher, care for Boucher's victims, and protect the public from future harm, asked Mancini directly in a meeting in Halifax why he had constantly failed to protect parishioners and the public from Boucher. According to the investigation, Mancini told Dowd that actually he had already offered to resign immediately as Archbishop of Halifax, Yarmouth. But the Pope's representative in Canada, the papal nuncio, Luigi Bonazzi, who had copies of the concerning documents that Dowd had uncovered and shared with him, told Mancini to stay put. Instead, what happened is a more graceful retirement was organized. Once again, the clergy closed ranks to protect their own. I will share my screen again. The media were not able to reach Archbishop Mancini as soon as this started to become news in Nova Scotia. And the media were not able to reach the papal nuncio to Canada because on December 10th, 2020, less than 2 weeks after the report, he was transferred to Albania. So I want to tell you a little bit about my research journey. A very early step in that research journey was attending a conference at the Atlantic School of Theology called Healing the Body, Church Renewal in Response to the Sexual Abuse Crisis. And the names on the screen may be familiar to some of our attendees. Catholics, researchers, scholars for whom I have great respect. These dedicated Catholics shared their research on what they called pathologies in the church. What pathologies? Sister Nuala Kenny spoke about the immature clerical culture made worse by mandatory celibacy. Professor David Dean talked about a church that punishes internal criticism and pities itself instead of victims. Cold internal legalism was cited. A church that still sometimes clings to the powers of state and empire to the point of invoking diplomatic immunity or using nunciatures to hide corruption or hide documents. A church that expects too much of priests, that alienates many good priests, and keeps the laity in a lower caste. So, acknowledgements to AST and to this conference for setting some of the stage for my research. Also acknowledgements to AST for its exceptional work as an educational institution, which I have directly experienced these past few years. To continue my own education, really to deepen sort of my own understanding as part of this research, I decided to enroll in the graduate certificate in theological studies. So I just completed my 10th and final course. And I believe one of my exceptional instructors, Marvin Anderson, is one of the attendees today. I'm very grateful to him and for all of our dialogue. I then set about trying to answer this question. Are there other Catholic governance models that have been tried? And even if they failed or partially failed, could they be tried again? Could they be modified in some form in our time? So I literally set out on the road. I visited Scranton, Pennsylvania, and you may recall that the Diocese of Scranton was featured in the Pennsylvania Grand Jury Report of 2018, detailing sexual abuse of children by more than 300 priests over several decades. The Diocese of Scranton was hearing warnings about what could happen as a result of the abuse of power even decades before the first crimes and incidents that were featured in the grand jury report. Let's step back to 1897 in the Scranton region. So there's significant immigration, a lot of it from Eastern Europe. Immigrants were arriving to work in the mines. Many of these were Polish immigrants. They thought they would find freedom in America, in Pennsylvania. Instead, they often found oppression in the mines and unfortunately often oppression in the church as well. The Polish immigrants in particular insisted on oversight of property and a role in selecting a pastor. There were some highly inappropriate and frankly discriminatory pastoral appointments that had been made. And so they insisted on a role in oversight. This was utterly denied. However, they thought there was still hope, so they turned to a sympathetic priest they knew named Father Francis Hodur. And he agreed to minister to them. He was working in a neighboring diocese at the time. And in fact, he set out for Rome, hoping to meet with the Pope, Pope Leo XIII, to share the grievances of the immigrant families in this part of the United States. He was denied a meeting with the Pope. He did get a meeting with a Polish cardinal in Rome, who told him to go right back because he didn't have a case. He got back and found out that he and some of the lay members who had called on him and recruited him were excommunicated. This is Francis Hodur, his gravesite in Scranton. Once excommunicated, the parishioners decided to keep going, actually. So they considered themselves Catholic, but obviously not Roman. They grew to a network of more than 100 churches, which sort of ultimately became a denomination, the Polish National Catholic Church, which still exists. The structure of their network was what they had tried to recommend to Rome. Parishes would own their own property. Parishes would be entitled to financial transparency. Parish priests would be selected jointly by the bishop and parish councils. Bishops would be vetted and elected by a synod and subject to terms of office. So somewhat similar to what we see in the Anglican Church or the Episcopal Church. A strong emphasis on ecumenism and interfaith cooperation and some other theological innovations. And significantly, after the 1921 Synod, priests could be married. And there was quite a discussion at the 1921 Synod. And a lot of the discussion was around how allowing married priests would change the culture of the church. How allowing married priests would lessen what they saw as the toxin of clericalism, okay, and serve as a kind of check, as they saw it, against abuses of power in various forms. I'll come back to this case study briefly in a few moments because this network and Rome have been in actually a lengthy dialogue about possibly a reconciliation. And I'll sort of tell you a little bit about the outcome of that. So the events with Francis Hodur, who later became Bishop Hodur, so the bishop ordained by the Old Catholic Church, the Diocese of Utrecht, and responsible for this network. These events started in 1897. He was made bishop in 1907 and served really until his death in 1953. So you could say, well, these are old events. Would the outcome have been different today? Would a more constructive resolution have been found today? And so this led me to sort of my second major road trip to St. Louis, my second case study, St. Louis, Missouri. This is St. Stanislaus Kostka Church in St. Louis. It was established in 1881. It's a Roman Catholic church, or was a Roman Catholic church, with its own incorporation bylaws and ownership of property, which is interesting. The bishop at the time actually insisted on this because he was concerned about debts sort of spilling over to the diocese. So he wanted to contain any debts with the construction of the church. So it became its own body corporate with its own board. And this structure already somewhat elevated the role of laity. Okay. And there was sort of more or less a coexistence between sort of the lay board and pastoral appointments for most of the church's history. But problems started to arise in the early 2000s. The Archdiocese of St. Louis, like so many other dioceses, archdioceses, was coming into major liability. And meanwhile, the parish had just constructed a cultural center, had just done some renovations, and they received a communication from the Archbishop of St. Louis at the time, Raymond Burke, who has kind of a reputation for other reasons. But Archbishop Raymond Burke asked the parish corporation to amend its bylaws so that he would have controlling interest over the property and finances of the parish. The parish declined this request and in fact amended the bylaws the other way to sort of make sure that the parishioners would have controlling interest over the property and finances. The response from Archbishop Burke was to pull the priest out of the church. So there were officially no masses or sacraments in the church. The parish was able to find some guest priests here and there, but then they found a priest from a neighboring diocese who was willing to serve with them on an ongoing basis. And he and the parish board were immediately excommunicated as a result of that decision. So this call for the new pastor who accepted the call. So they were immediately excommunicated. As Archbishop Burke wrote, they had placed themselves in a state of heresy and schism. This actually became big news in St. Louis, and it's believed to be part of the reason why Archbishop Burke was promoted, so to speak. Later became Cardinal Raymond Burke, head of the Apostolic Signatura, the Vatican High Court under Pope Benedict, not a close friend of Pope Francis. But often what happens is sort of kind of you make a mess in your diocese, you might find yourself sort of promoted up in order to make room for someone else. So a new archbishop comes in and offers a compromise of sorts, where the parish corporation, the parish board could remain and have ownership over the property, but it would lease the property to the archdiocese. And in the event that the archdiocese were to suppress the parish, then the board could take the property back as long as it agrees to maintain it as a Roman Catholic church. But a key condition was that the priest who had agreed to come, that he could not continue. So his excommunication would remain, and they would have to get a new, the archbishop would appoint a new priest. So the parish declined this proposal. And as a result, the archdiocese brought a legal action against the parish corporation. To make a long story short, the parish corporation prevailed in court. In a famous line, or in a much-cited line, the judge, the Missouri Circuit Court, said the archbishop might have control over the souls of the members of St. Stanislaus, but he does not have control over the St. Stanislaus Parish Corporation. And so St. Stanislaus continued on its own and continues on its own to this day and is still trying to discern its future. The members identify themselves as Catholics, although not Roman. And of course, part of Catholic theology is apostolic succession. So who is their bishop? To whom are they attached? For a while, it seemed like maybe they would be attached to the Episcopal Church while maintaining all of their liturgy and traditions. But that did not succeed. But I'd like to draw a contrast for you here. Here we have essentially what started as a property dispute. Now sort of the chasm has become greater because the parish has sort of embraced a more liberal theology ever since the schism. For example, supporting women priests, blessing same-sex marriages. But it started as a property dispute. And the consequence in the property dispute was immediate excommunication. The consequence for the recent case study of cover-up that I shared with you a few moments ago was an honorable retirement. So something's not working in the system. But would all of this have happened under Pope Francis? So the excommunication at St. Stanislaus, this is still before Pope Francis. You might ask, well, would it have turned out differently under Pope Francis? Obviously, I can't answer that question definitively. But what I can tell you is that Bishop Holders, the late Bishop Holders network, known as the PNCC, the Polish National Catholic Church, and the Roman Catholic Church, have had an extensive dialogue over decades about whether there is an opportunity for reconciliation for the parishes, the 100 plus 125 parishes of the PNCC to come back into communion with Rome after more than a century. And you might think, well, a stumbling block is the married priest. Stumbling block is not the married priest. Rome is willing to accept the married priest. The stumbling block is the fact that the lay boards have authority over property and finances, as well as the fact that Rome was insisting that the priests who left the Roman Catholic Church, often because they got married or wanted to get married, and began ministering for the PNCC churches, that they would not be readmitted. Okay. So, and this is in our time. This is in Pope Francis's time, that they cannot find the basis for a reconciliation. And actually, the PNCC has largely given up on that possibility as we speak. So this question of lay boards and property, like, haven't we seen some bishops themselves propose parish boards in Canada? And of course, we have the example, the long-standing example of the Fabrique in Quebec. We have the recent PEI, Civil Incorporation of Parishes. The Halifax-Yarmouth Archdiocese tried it in 2017 with Bill 30. But this was ultimately denied, or this was ultimately allowed to die on the order paper by the legislature because of the same issue that you see in the preceding bullet points, the PEI in Quebec, where the bishop would still have a controlling interest over the corporation. So the concern in Halifax-Yarmouth was that this might be a way just to move assets around, to sort of shield them, but the bishop would still have essentially total control over the parish corporation. So are there paths forward? And here is where I really will sort of value your discussion, your feedback, your guidance. I will explore a few possible interventions, constructive interventions that might have a cascading effect, that might start to get at the problems of structure and culture and secrecy or lack of transparency that lend themselves to abuses of power in many forms. And in exploring these possibilities, I will move from the level of the universal church. I'll propose an intervention at the level of universal church, but I won't stop there. I'll come right down to the level of the individual agency. Okay. So allowing married priests, which I would submit, and I'm not alone in this, as sort of a student of church governance, probably a critical step for cultural change and structural change, which may result in subsequent changes. I'm just going to quote a couple of paragraphs from an article that I wrote for a collection of essays, a collection of my essays called Dignity, Democracy, Development, a Citizen's Reader. And the title of the article is Can Political Science Help a Troubled Church? So Pope Francis has already floated the idea of more broadly permitting married priests. There are already married priests among converts, for example, Anglicans who have joined the Catholic Church, the Roman Catholic Church, and Eastern Rite Catholics who are in communion with Rome. But more broadly, allowing married priests could change church culture for the better. I am not suggesting for a moment that single or celibate people are inherently ill-suited to ministry, but a whole priestly caste of single men creates a closed and insecure system. Even today, a priest is in a lonely place on his pedestal. It's hard for a father to have confidants other than other priests or the bishop, to whom he has sworn not just loyalty, but obedience. On the other hand, a spouse's income from another job, frank advice, and life experience could help at least a few more priests to gain balance and moral courage to challenge abuses of all kinds. So this could be sort of an incision into the system that sort of has a salutary or starts to have a healing effect. Okay, so we'll just go to the next slide, please. Okay, so standing diocesan synods, these would be permitted already by Canon 460. And so what I'm suggesting here, and this could be done by any bishop now, is to sort of recognize the existence of an ongoing diocesan synod that includes a lay representation. I'm suggesting that each synod would have a kind of permanence, that it would be part of the landscape of the diocese, somewhat similar to an Anglican structure. And as part of my research, I actually spent some time attending the diocesan synod of the Anglican Diocese of Nova Scotia and PEI, and learned some interesting things there. So it would be composed of parish representatives, periodically elected, plus clergy. The law of the church allows this already. The bishop would still be the recognized spiritual leader, but the diocesan synod would have one power at the outset: to approve the annual levy or tax that the bishop requires from parishes. And before voting, the synod could ask questions, seek information about budgets and policies, sometimes do a management audit, insist on professional best practices, and satisfy itself that spending is truly aligned with spiritual values. So the synod, even with just that one power, would have leverage, while still recognizing their apostolic succession and the role of the bishop as the spiritual leader. Amending the custom-made civil statutes that give bishops corporation sole powers. And I'd love to talk about this more. Maybe we could do this in the discussion, but I explored this issue in a recent paper presented to the Atlantic Provinces Political Science Association. And I tracked the progression of special civil laws in the 19th and early 20th centuries, which sort of went from quite decentralized, actually, to the bishop himself being a corporation and having complete ownership of property in the diocese and complete control of finances and personnel in the diocese. And to make this happen, the bishop wasn't sort of going to the province and saying, "So I'm incorporating under the Societies Act like any other nonprofit society." The bishop was actually using political influence, certainly in the case of the Diocese of Antigonish, which I explored in detail for this paper, was actually using political influence to get a special statute written so that the diocese could sort of stand outside the normal processes of incorporation. Right? And so there may be a correction possible here through the civil authorities, so that the incorporation can be like any other society. If the church wishes to incorporate itself, then it has to accept what other nonprofit organizations are required to do: to hold an annual general meeting, to have a board, to file various reports that are publicly accessible. Okay. And if that's not possible, if sort of statutory change is not possible, I suggested in the paper that we might be able to look at the CRA filings. This is the Canada Revenue Agency. Every registered charity in Canada, including Catholic charities, have to file a charity information return annually. And they have to identify what are called directors, trustees, and like officials. A group of people who are their directors, trustees, and like officials. And these directors, trustees, and like officials, the majority of them have to be at arm's length from each other. And I think there's an argument to be made that in a corporation sole, like a diocese, the other directors, trustees, and like officials, who might be the chancellor of the priest, who's the chancellor of the diocese, or the staff administrator, whoever else the bishop chose to put on the form, that those people are not at arm's length from the bishop. because they are direct subordinates in a situation where the bishop is the sole member, trustee, and director of the corporation. Parishioners are not members of the corporation. So there may be an interesting sort of path here to sort of open things up a little bit through the CRA filings. Okay, so these are community covenants or parish covenants. And this will be challenging, sort of, but possible in some instances. Why would this be challenging? And so my case study here is the equipping the saints exercise in the Archdiocese of Halifax Yarmouth. The Archdiocese of Halifax Yarmouth reorganized its parishes, reduced the number to just 20, if I'm not mistaken. And the parishes were essentially built around priests, so far fewer available priests. So we'll build parishes around priests. And so that meant that sort of everything between, if you can envision a map of Nova Scotia, everything between Windsor and Digby became one parish with 17 churches, right? One parish pastoral council, one finance committee, in principle, at least a common collection. And so many of these service points, because that's what they are now, sort of like franchise service points, even though they are built in still real viable communities, they don't even have a seat on the parish pastoral council, which itself is merely advisory. Right? But what if some of these communities had covenants that they're determined to sort of keep going and be responsible to each other, right? That maybe they're a little bit beyond the philosophy. I'm quoting here from something that a priest in our diocese wrote in his bulletin in terms of praying for vocations, and sort of saying, well, we've got to pray for vocations because the priest is the visible center of unity in a parish around whom the people of God congregate, that a parish can't function without a priest. Well, maybe it can, right? And maybe we need to be open to that possibility. And we'll go to the next slide, please. Okay. What could be components of covenants? This could be a parish or a community of Catholics who are sort of determined to be mutually responsible and to do ministry together. Obviously, like radical hospitality and holy manners, inclusion, going to the margins, a commitment to leadership training, to transparency, commitment to continuity and community, even if no priest is present. My own parish has gone a distance toward this. We haven't gone this far in terms of like an actual covenant. We do have our bylaws. We do sort of have our commitment to transparency and sort of mutual responsibility, a structure of co-responsibility. But going this extra step, the covenant, that would require a lot of discernment and soul searching. But it is possible, I think, in some instances. Okay. And we'll go to the next one. Individual acts of solidarity and dignified resistance. Okay. Might this sometimes include a Eucharistic fast? If our neighbor, our fellow parishioner is denied the Eucharist for a specious reason, right? Or for a reason that seeks to maintain the power and control of the institutional structure, do we show some solidarity with them? I sort of have a positive or negative example from my own sort of parish membership. A new priest. We haven't had a resident priest for most of our recent history, but we do have sort of regular Sunday Mass, and we have occasional residencies by priests. So a new priest came and decided that a practice that the parish had been living for many years, which is sort of an inclusive approach to the washing of feet on Holy Thursday, would no longer continue, would not continue, and that only men would be asked to have their feet washed. And so when I was asked, I declined, and I gave the reason. So that's maybe a positive example. An example where I was maybe not courageous enough was in preparation for marriage. My spouse, Alison Ederer, is a United Church minister. And so we have a mixed marriage, an ecumenical marriage, a beautiful ecumenical marriage. And sort of the only accompaniment or support I received in preparation for marriage was a meeting with the priest who was assigned, like the non-resident priest assigned to our parish at the time, who told me that I needed to sign a form. And the form would commit me to doing everything in my power to raising any future children, to baptizing and raising any future children in the Catholic Church and not in my spouse's church. We already had a sense that any future children would likely be baptized by their mom and would not be in a situation where they would be told that they can't take communion from their mom. We were committed that any future children, and now with baby Oliver, would be active members of the community, active participants in the community, which baby Oliver is. But we already knew that probably the baptism would not happen in my church. And I was confronted with this document. We were in the middle of rebuilding the church. It was an intensive time. My sort of rationalization was, I don't want to sort of create personal drama for the church. I'm a member of a community here. And I wasn't really in my heart, I wasn't really promising that I would do everything in my power to make sure that the baptism happens in this physical space. And yet I signed the document. Right? Would my sort of individual act of dignified resistance, if I was sort of true to this fifth point here, would it have maybe led me in a different way? Okay. So we have individual agency. And I think that's that's a key part of the Christian message. Okay, and we'll go to the next slide. So can concerned Catholics repair the church? And my response after all this is I don't know. But I don't discount the Holy Spirit and our own God-given ingenuity. And so I'd like to share a final reflection, and maybe if we could stop the screen share. This is an article that I wrote last month. It was actually sort of one of my columns. And the title is, why are most in brackets, so not all, why are most Christian churches withering in Canada? And I think you'll detect some of my discouragement and some of my hope. Some of the reasons here for that answer, I don't know. For Christians, the pre-Christmas season of Advent, so again, this was written last month, is a time to take stock, to prayerfully prepare for something better and holier than what is and what was. This year, we might ask, what on earth are we doing? How did so many of us and our churches go so far off course? Can we make it right? I should be clear on this point. The vitality of Christianity is not a numbers game. In 2021, only 53.3% of Canadians identified as Christians, compared to 77.1% in 2001. That's not alarming in itself. But most of the decline is not because of the positive addition of immigrants of other faiths. It's because millions of Canadians have moved from Christian to none, meaning no religious affiliation. Christian churches are withering in Canada. The withering is not the inevitable result of secularism in civic and political life. People still want to connect with a spiritual current, to be inspired to more generous and meaningful lives, to be part of communities that affirm each person and lift up the good, to explore the sources of ethics, to be awestruck by the universe and all aspects of creation. If modern Christian churches were actually determined to carry on the work of Jesus of Nazareth, they would be pretty relevant and robust right now. They would be a vital progressive movement in Canada, regardless of numbers, harnessing that spiritual yearning, that yearning for justice, for the good. Dogmas and organizational structures aside, the work of Jesus of Nazareth, or that type of work, is desperately needed in our mean and troubled world. I am thinking about loving neighbors and enemies, seeing the divine in the poor and the oppressed, making it a spiritual mission to stand with outcasts, caring for creation. We would be healing instead of hoarding. Radical hospitality would supplant rigid and cruel human hierarchies. Peace would be prioritized over prestige. Sadly, the diminishing Christian churches try to cling to the soulless old days, sometimes without even realizing it. In generations past, they might have had more people in the pews, but their leaders were often sellouts. They celebrated rather than mourned when states and empires favored them and showered them with wealth, or entrusted them with dirty projects like the abusive residential schools in Canada. Today, some of the churches are still heavy with dogma and reams of bizarre internal laws and even canonical tribunals that subordinate people based on gender, sexual orientation, and marital status. Others have shed such unholy exclusion, but seem to be in maintenance mode, content with a few projects and resolutions, but lacking a deeper spirituality. In some ways, the original sin of the church as organization was teaming up with the Emperor Constantine in the year 312. It's an original sin that's been hard to shake. Sadly, the localized units, parishes and congregations, frequently tend to be inward-looking, suspicious of outsiders, prone to petty jealousies, and resistant to change. Often they won't take any risks to live out the gospel message, to put their assets, their property, bank accounts, routines at the service of their mission. But there are exceptions to all this. Here and there, often on the margins, a holy spark and the Holy Spirit kept showing up. St. Francis of Assisi had that spark. Dorothy Day had it. And in Cape Breton, Father Jimmy Tompkins had it. In our day, someone like spiritual leader Michael Curry, Episcopal presiding bishop, has it. This Advent, this is again last month, check out one of his sermons or books. His stirring appeals to the power of love and to the idea of a positive, not fundamentalist, Jesus movement are actually more compelling than his much talked about sermon at the wedding of Prince Harry and Meghan Markle. So this Advent, or we could say this year now, if you're a member of a church, see if you can engage your peers in a serious discussion. What is God actually calling us to do in the community and the world, even if we are just a few? If you're a former Christian, please look for that light. If you're a former Christian, please look for that light within and ask a similar question. If you practice another faith, I wish you strength in your own spiritual journey of reflection, generosity, and active service. In all our beautiful diversity, let's try to grow in those common values that will lead to a civilization of love. Thank you for all you do toward a civilization of love. And again, it's my pleasure to be with you today. God bless. Thank you.
All right. With that, I'd like to remind everyone that if you have a question or comment for Tom, please do enter that in the chat function of the Zoom meeting. And we have received a couple of comments and questions. So Tom, I'll present those to you. First of all, just a general comment that your presentation was excellent and inspiring. Question. What has happened to the Newfoundland parishes? I don't know if you're familiar with this, but which repurchased their churches after the dissolution of property. Did the Greater Church retake control of the property, or was a different model used? What happened there?
Yeah, this is going to be a really interesting one to watch, and I'm glad that's come forward. So my understanding is that where the parishes, including the Cathedral Parish, even in St. John's, have sort of like successfully bid on their own properties, that they have set up sort of separate corporations, and those corporations are not structured in a way where the bishop has controlling interest. So it's going to actually be interesting to watch what happens, let's say, over the next generation with this structure, and whether we'll sort of see a more sort of co-equal model of governance and of being community, now that the laity really do have to accept a kind of fiduciary responsibility, at least for the parish properties. Yeah, it's a great example.
Thanks. Next question is, what should we as committed Catholics do at the practical level in response to the many problems in the church? Doing nothing is not acceptable to the questioner's conscience. So what do you think should happen there? And I think you somewhat addressed this in your last the last part of your article, but maybe it worth reiterating.
Yeah, I think I would again go back to that point number 5 to start, sort of individual acts of solidarity and even dissent, yeah, it's sort of, and even sort of like a kind of fearlessness about that, and I don't mean sort of creating drama. Sort of in the example that I cited, sort of my own case, like the threat actually was held over me. Like you can't continue to serve in lay leadership functions if you don't sign this document. You can't approach communion if you don't sign this document. But you know, at some point we have to look past sort of those threats as individuals. The community covenants, see if that's possible at the parish level or even at a sub-parish level. Sort of an advantage in my own sort of faith community that it is relatively small. So there is sort of a sense of what are the sort of the perspectives and gifts of different folks, and how to sort of bring those forward. In larger parishes, it may be a little bit more difficult, but looking for those opportunities for the community covenants. And then I would not discount the interventions. It may take a little bit of time, but with respect to the civil law. When I presented that paper about the civil incorporation, the corporation sole model, which is used through much of North America, where sort of the bishop is the corporation, he's the only member of the diocese. The Catholic faithful are not considered members of the diocese. Not even the priests are considered members of the diocese. When I sort of gave that presentation, there was actually sort of a very robust and thoughtful discussion, academic discussion that followed. And so some of my colleagues with a background in political science and the law wondered why the corporation sole model is permitted at all for any kind of corporation other than maybe the crown itself. And that there may be sort of an opportunity or an opening for legal reform that just sort of eliminates that or phases out any kind of corporation sole. So obviously that would include the Catholic corporation sole. So they would have to find another way to incorporate, and inevitably that would that would involve some fiduciary role for the laity. So I hope that helps a little bit, but I'm happy to sort of take supplementary questions or sort of other feedback or reaction to my responses.
Sure. So I guess, you know, we get this question a lot in our discussions, but you know, when we're dealing with these disturbing issues in our church, can you share with you personally what keeps you going as a member of the Catholic Church?
Yeah, it is the local faith community. Yeah, what I described in that sort of that welcome message that I read at the beginning of my presentation, and which I delivered just last Sunday, is really sort of, it's really sincere. It's from the heart. It's an attachment to sort of a kind of beautiful grassroots Catholicism that's mystical, that moves with the seasons, that's inclusive, that's radically hospitable, that's not fundamentalist, that and certainly in the case of Polish Catholicism, there's certainly an argument to be made that it incorporates, and these have, many of the examples of this have survived in sort of the Cape Breton Polonia, the Cape Breton Polish community, sort of like pre-Christian sort of traditions, a kind of syncretism has happened, which is fascinating. And it's survived and even thrived in some cases, partly because of the history of the parish itself. It was a relatively small community, sort of on the eastern edge of Canada. For much of its history, it did not have Polish priests, even though sort of the language was used and the singing, the liturgy, the traditions. And so often the lay people were teaching any priests who were either visiting or posted, resident back in the day, sort of their traditions, their practices. So there's a bit of a heritage of kind of co-participation, co-responsibility, and that made it easier for us, I think, to get through these crises, as stressful as they were. So the closure crisis, the fire, the rebuilding, the disputes, frankly, with the diocese, and to still emerge sort of positive and in some ways even more faithful as a result of all that adversity. So certainly I do derive a lot of energy from my local community, and I'm blessed and grateful for that.
We've had a comment from someone who's, and I think we've all experienced the, when priests change in a church, or a new priest comes in, you sometimes find that there's a priest that's, they're either jaded or they're tired or they're just not willing to engage in change. What ideas do you have for laity to deal with that? How can that be addressed?
Yeah. I'm not going to answer that. This answer will probably not be a full answer. And so again, I'm going to sort of invite a dialogue. But I think sort of at a parish level, it's certainly important to look for those opportunities to ensure that the parish has a sense of itself as a community, right? A community that sort of that outlives every pastoral appointment, and as welcoming as the community may be to any new priest, and as constructive as it's determined to be in working with that priest, whether the priest is resident or just sort of an occasional minister to the community. Certainly, in the case of my own parish community, in 2012, actually, like in the middle of some of these crises, we went through a bit of a process, a discernment process, where we sort of started to imagine what the next 10 years would look like for us. We live in an economically struggling region, population decline, other challenges. Of course, the diocese was going through major upheaval. The previous bishop had been arrested and was ultimately convicted for the possession of child pornography. There's major sort of crisis of morale at the diocese. So we started to imagine what the next 10 years might look like for our parish, even though sort of the threat of closure was hanging over us at that time. And once we sort of agreed on a document, we kept coming back to it. We agreed to a mission statement as a parish, and to this day keep coming back to it. And once we had those sort of foundations in place, we set out to sort of define a structure for our parish. So what does a parish council or pastoral council, Rada, as we call it, what does the Rada look like for us? What kinds of, how do we recruit for it? What's the role of a nominations committee? How do we do orientation for people who might be considering or whom we might be reaching out for to serve? And sort of all of those sort of decisions, or all that work continues to have its effect today. So and it's helped us get through some very different personalities among priests who have come our way. Some completely exhausted, sort of others sort of a little more difficult to deal with. But the radas, the councils, have been really mature, I think, or certainly over the past decade, in just sort of calmly navigating the ship through the problems. So having a sense of your parish as a community and doing some work as lay people on a structure that keeps going, a standing structure, to cultivate lay leaders, that would be critical in my opinion. And if you can't do that through the parish, are there other sort of parallel opportunities to meet and minister as Catholics, as lay Catholics?
So kind of follow on to this, one of the questions addresses the 5 adjustments that you mentioned. Each poses challenges. So from a systems perspective, those small changes can have an exponential effect. So with that in mind, are there some specific small changes that come to your mind that you could name that we could pursue individually at our parishes?
Yeah. So I would sort of challenge everyone to think about whether something like the parish covenant, or at least sort of the parish plan, or and I sort of use this word advisedly, like a democratic structure, is possible at the parish level. And is there an opportunity to make that happen? In the case of my own parish, there was. We haven't gotten to the covenant level yet, but certainly the structural work has happened, and that's been critical to our survival, and to our ministry, to even being able to ask maturely, thoughtfully, what is God calling us to do as a community? How do we show solidarity with others, not just within the parish community, but outside? So again, are there opportunities to create some sprouts or sparks at the local level? It's a little harder to work at the universal church level, and this is where I do feel somewhat discouraged. I mean, you take the example of Pope Francis. I mean, he struggled with the curia, with the structures, with the cultures. I gave the example of the Archdiocese of Montreal, and I didn't mention what happened after the Capriolo report. So one of Justice Capriolo's key recommendations was that the Archdiocese appoint an ombudsperson. And the Archbishop of Montreal, to his credit, said, I accept this recommendation. I will appoint an independent ombudsperson who will deal with the sort of grievances, complaints, allegations of abuse of power. And so the ombudsperson was appointed and set out to do her work. Just last month, I guess at the end of November, the ombudsperson resigned in protest, describing the atmosphere within the archdiocese as, in her words, Kafkaesque. The archivist, who was simply supporting the ombudsperson would request documents, the archivist would look for them, produce them. The archivist was subject to threats from within the organization, had to take a leave of absence for health reasons because of how burdensome that role had become, simply because the ombudsperson or the archivist was responding to what would otherwise be routine requests from the ombudsperson. So let's take as a given that the Archbishop of Montreal actually, in good faith, wanted to clean things up, and yet was blocked, right? So at the universal church, even at the diocesan level, we've got a lot of challenges. But, and I'm still continuing to float these possibilities with something like, if we could bring ourselves as a universal church, and we haven't painted ourselves into a corner on married priests. Like, it would be nothing is easy at the level of the universal church, but it's relatively easy compared to some other reforms to allow married priests. There's precedent for it already, and not just historical, but current. So, and that could start to change the culture. But the diocesan synods, right? So the Archbishop of Montreal has this failed experiment with the ombudsperson. I mean, hopefully he'll try again. But if there's a way that he could institutionalize some accountability where sort of the laity could ask questions before voting on the levy. I mean, this is like, this putting on my political science hat, this is like Parliament in its nascent stage, right? Initially, that was its power, just simply to vote supply, right? And it leveraged that to sort of make the executive a little more honest, right? And that's something maybe we could try to do in collaboration with a sympathetic bishop somewhere and set that precedent.
Right. And when we're looking at the universal church, to what extent do you think Pope Francis is kind of picking his battles? And do you see synodality as something that will help him to it may be helpful to him and helpful for us in terms of building the efforts that you're talking about in our parishes?
Yeah, my honest answer is I don't know. And Pope Francis is clever. He does sort of have a long view. He does have a sort of sense of institutional cause and effect. He is looking for openings. He even has a little bit of a sense of humor in how he shuffles positions, like someone like Cardinal Raymond Burke. So he's fascinating to watch. And he's getting exhausted. His predecessor certainly sort of was essentially floored by just the inability to start to clean up the institutional church. So I guess it's an open question. I don't know, and again, I would welcome others' opinion on this.
Do you see any signs that that he's moving towards more core responsibility in parishes and in the church, at the larger church?
Well, I kind of note with interest the sort of critique that came out about Pope Francis, written by Cardinal Pell, but it only sort of came out after Cardinal Pell passed away recently. And so that was one of his critiques, that sort of in preparing for these synods, that there's sort of this vast lay consultation that's happening, and in Cardinal Pell's view, I guess this is opening a can of worms. So there is some fear on the part of the sort of the hardliners that this will ultimately sort of be like a train that you can't bring back into the station. So I mean, yeah, I think at least that there's a vague vision on Pope Francis's part that the laity will play a more responsible role. And of course, he has spoken about, he sort of has implored even members of the laity to, in a constructive way, obviously, but challenge your pastors, be thinking members of the church, and because that's your holy and sacred responsibility.
Yeah. So there's a question here, and I don't know if there is an answer for this. So I'll just pose it to you. What is there an instruction? What instruction or courses for seminarians would be a benefit for the church moving forward? Some course that would help them realize the benefits of having participation from parishioners in governance, etc.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I know certainly there is some move to have more courses for sort of Catholic seminarians, let's say taught by lay people. I think in seminaries generally, courses in management, governance, professional standards. There is sort of a lot of room for that. I've appreciated my own sort of AST educational experience recently at Atlantic School of Theology, which is an ecumenical institution. It doesn't form priests, but there are Catholic students, and the Catholic Church is a partner in the Atlantic School of Theology. Some of the students from the other denominations are training to be ministers. Or priests in the case of the Anglican Church. And so I could just, from that experience, I could maybe just very positively and constructively recommend just some more work on is sort of management. If you're kind of like a CEO in some cases, what does that look like? Accounting, community development, community economic development. It's certainly in my own regional context in Cape Breton Island, in some communities, the churches are the community developers. They're sort of the only social services, local social services left standing. And so parishioners or members of a congregation, the priests or ministers, are left to deal with complex social challenges. And I'm not so sure that the training and education for people going into ministry is as strong as it needs to be in that respect.
Right. I have Nicole who would like to ask a question. So Nicole, I'll just get you to unmute your mic.
It's been a wonderful afternoon, Dr. Tom, and thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you.
I'm from the Ottawa Diocese. I have been a part of a large group called Concerned Catholics of Ottawa since the mid-1980s. We moved out of the Corpus movement around the world, which is married priests and those who support them. We are still together. I'm the young one, and I'm 80 years old. And what we've talked about today has been talked about many times, and your solutions to move forward are so real and have been around. When we were very active, we had Marcel Gervais was our bishop. We had meetings with him. And I'm a member of St. Joseph's Parish. It's an oblate parish where we have hired an executive director 20 years ago. I can tell you all kinds of things that we did. I mean, when Terry Prendergast became bishop, he came to visit us once because I think he wanted to shut us down. But the things that he asked us to do, we didn't do. And it brought me back to the days. I'm a product of Bishop Alexander Carter for 33 years. He was our bishop. And I remember him saying very clearly many, many times, yes, I am your bishop, but that's all I am. And I think one of the things that has been really positive in my own life here in the Ottawa Diocese and in the Sault Ste. Marie Diocese many years ago is organization, and not to be afraid, because so many people have lost hope. They've just walked away from the church because they just do not know what to do and where to go with it and how to do it. These new orders of priests and nuns that are starting up, right from pre-Vatican. I'm a retired chaplain, and of 25 years in the Ottawa Diocese. And I have to say, organization is really powerful. And if you are not afraid to stand on the pew and speak what it is you need to say. One of the things that I'm very concerned about now is the coordinators of religious education departments in our Catholic high school system in the province of Ontario is making statements like Vatican II was a mistake. That's a huge statement, and it's made very openly. Another thing is the removal of all of the Vatican II beautiful religious education programs that were written since 1970. And we're dealing with young people from 5 years of age to 18 years of age in the Catholic school system. That's a lot of verbiage. That's a lot of conversation and teaching. And they're getting this. I was a chaplain at St. Patrick's High School in Ottawa. We had a school population of 1,500. Less than 500 were Roman Catholic. I had 400 Muslim students. For me, it de-ghettoized the Catholic school. overnight for me. And it was wonderful. It was beautiful. The conversations that happened were incredible. So where do we go? Because I'm like you, I don't know. My parish of St. Joseph, we just kind of hibernate from everybody else because we are very progressive. And being an oblate parish, we are quite independent. And as Terry Prendergast so often tried to stop things, we just ignored him and we just did not do it. But you know, when you're standing there with 500 people who support you, it's easy. We're not going to get gold chalices, and we're not going to put the kneelers back in the church. Well, I'm telling you to. Well, that's, you can tell us to, but we're not going to do it. And we didn't do it. That's takes a lot of courage, but it takes a strong, organized community who's all on the same boat. And, you know, my biggest concern, though, is because I spent 40 years in the Catholic school system, is the Catholic school system. Many people teachers who have retired, and many chaplains who have retired are making the comment now, the Catholic school system in Ontario doesn't have any right to exist any longer because the conservatives have really taken over. And when you destroy the religious education program, that's, to me, that's dangerous. That's just very dangerous. My question was, what are our paths forward? Where do we go? But that was my question at the beginning of your time with us today. But now I have about 50 questions.
Well, maybe we can give Tom an opportunity to respond. There's a lot of great points there, Nicole. Thank you for your comments.
No, I'm sort of just humbled listening to all the points. Look forward to continuing the conversation, Nicole, and really value your experience over decades. So no, I really am sort of humbled just to listen to your experience. I'm going to. This is almost a footnote, and it's in the scheme of the big issues we've been talking about. It's minor, but sort of you gave an example of sort of almost like liturgical design. We almost had the opposite situation when we were rebuilding St. Mary's. So we connected with a small parish community in Manitoba. The first pastor, Father Antoni Puczynski, in 1915, left here to go there, and he helped the small Polish community in Wisła, Manitoba, to start a church. And so we hadn't had any contact with that parish in 100 years. But after the fire, we developed a wonderful rapport with several of their parishioners, led by Dennis and Diane Janczycki, wonderful people. And they had an extra sort of old high altar, because the church that burned had a beautiful high altar, sort of handmade by our parishioners. And they raised money and they rented a trailer, and they drove the high altar across country to Cape Breton. And we unloaded it. It needed an awful lot of work. It hadn't been used in decades, but we were able to engage some local craftspeople. Parks Canada, the Fortress of Louisbourg National Historic Site, offered us some really valuable advice. And just sort of as a community project, the high altar came back to life. With so many stories to tell around it, so many friendships made around just the high altar coming from rural Manitoba to Cape Breton. And so we were just putting the finishing touches on the high altar. It was right down to the wire. It was 2 weeks before the rebuilt church was scheduled to open, and a call came from the bishop. And he said, you're going to have to take that high altar down. This is not consistent with modern liturgical principles. And our response was, sorry, Bishop, it's too late. We would have to take down the walls of the church at this point. So the high altar is going to have to stay. And there it is, with so many wonderful, loving stories to tell around it. So that's not an answer to any of the sort of brilliant and insightful points you made, Nicole, other than to say I really do look forward to continuing the conversation.
We had someone commented that they've seen the altar many times, but didn't know the history. It's even more beautiful learning the story. So there you go.
Thank you.
A couple of comments, and we're getting close to the end of our time today, but a couple of comments here, just from a structural point of view. Michelle noted that she thinks it would be helpful if lay persons were part of the formation and placement of priests. Also, that there would be standards and practice known and over which priests are called into account.
Yes, yeah, agreed. Professional performance appraisals. I would suspect that many of us who are part of this meeting today in our lines of work, we are evaluated. And our colleagues or people with whom we work are invited to be part of a process that results in constructive feedback for us to improve in our professional lives. And we're not seeing that often. In the case of clergy. That could be done. That could be done now in any diocese. It could even sort of be proposed by a parish as a pilot for a diocese. And frankly, I think many good priests would be all in favor of that. Certainly, if I were serving in ministry, I would want that. Because it also sort of puts constructive criticism into the framework of a process rather than gossip and intrigue. So that certainly would be a step. Some kind of co-responsibility when a pastoral appointment is made. So it's not a surprise to, sometimes it's an utter surprise to the priests themselves and to the parish. There's no orientation, so there's just no system around this. And especially if the parish hasn't done the prior homework around setting up its own structures of governance and administration, what you often do get is a kind of, I guess I would call it a pathology, where maybe you have some sort of vague structure around finance committee or parish council or whatever, but someone thinks they can just sort of do an end run around that and develop a special relationship with Father. And so if your influence in the parish is determined based on sort of how many encounters or sort of conversations you might have with Father in the space of a month or a week, that's obvious. That's not healthy. It's immature. It's outdated. And we're going nowhere as a church if we can't deal with sort of problems like that. And those are structural problems.
One of the comments made by Terry here was a lot of what we've been talking about, a lot of what you're proposing is premised on a parish community, but a parish community, and we'll put that in quotes, air quotes. But most parishes are not necessarily communities in the sense that you've indicated, and since a movement for change really needs a critical mass of like-minded people, it presents a challenge for individuals to just hang in there. Not everyone feels strong enough to be the local prophetic voice. So I guess Terry's looking for your commentary on that.
It's a great comment. It's a great insight. And if we think about those dioceses where the parishes have been radically reorganized. So again, I would give the example of Halifax, Yarmouth. If most of the South Shore of Nova Scotia has one parish. The Annapolis Valley is one parish. So that's not a parish, that's a region, right? With multiple churches, multiple franchises or service points. So you may have lost the opportunity to sort of work at the parish level in those instances. But can we organize informally in situations like that? So the Catholics of a particular community, even if they are not constituted as a parish, obviously do have freedom of association. Concerned lay Catholics have exercised your freedom of association. So it may be sort of creating those intentional communities, those intentional spiritual communities that are sort of inclusive and open and public in their existence. That may be the way to go if the existing parish structure simply doesn't provide those openings.
All right. Well, thank you very much. I'm going to turn our presentation today over to Joy Warner, who will say a few words. And over to you, Joy.
Well, thank you so much, Tom. It's been a joy to, I shouldn't use that word since my name is Joy, but I will use it anyway. It has been a joy to spend this time with you. And as so many, I think, attending this session this afternoon, many of us have spent a lifelong sort of attempt to change the church, or not to change the church, but at least to hold it accountable, to ask for more transparency, to have a voice. And you have given us, I think, great inspiration and great support. You gave us, and I was fascinated by the historical attempts of lay people to have a stronger voice that you showed us in St. Louis and Scranton. That so long ago, people were already working on these very issues. That's inspiring, even though in many ways they didn't get what they had hoped to get. I think you also inspired us, and I loved the term you used, that we are capable as individuals of acts of solidarity and dignified resistance. I think that phrase is a wonderful phrase. And the building of community, I think, is so crucial, and you've really emphasized that. And if you can't build it within the parish, then there are ways to build community outside of the parish. But I think that keeping going in these difficult times and being courageous are so important. And you have been courageous yourself. You've given us an example of courage, not being afraid, and not being afraid to dissent. And I think be thinking members of the church and challenge your pastors. And that takes courage, right? And you have given us not just a lecture about it, but your life is a witness to that. And so we really are so grateful for you to come and give us hope and give us inspiration to hang in there and to believe that the Holy Spirit is indeed working in the church and in all of us. So thank you so much, Tom, and may your work continue to flourish.
Thank you so much, Joy. I'm moved by everything you said, and look forward to continuing to work with you.
Thank you.
So now it's over to me to make some closing remarks and to usher us on with the rest of our day today. I just wanted to quickly mention to our little speakers group who had roles this today, including Tom, we usually stay on for about 5 minutes after, just to take our leave of each other. It's very unsatisfying to just everybody disappear from the webinar after we've done this. I forgot to mention that before. So if you could just stay on. So to everyone who came today, I want to thank you again for joining us from wherever you are geographically or spiritually on this journey of faith, and for your participation. It's always welcomed at CLC. And we hope that Concerned Lay Catholics is able to help you deepen your understanding of and commitment to our shared mission as members of the Catholic Church. Our next webinar will be held on Saturday, March 25th, and will feature Dr. Adriana Barra, expert on ecumenism and interreligious dialogue. Dr. Barra will speak on the ecumenical and interreligious dialogue as a source of healing in a fractured world. Before we leave today, if you found today's presentation helpful in your faith journey and would like to support us in bringing more events like this forward in future, please consider making a financial contribution, either a one-time or ongoing gift, and any amount, no matter how small, helps. You can do this by going to our website and using the link provided. If you've donated in the past or you're unable to make a financial contribution at this time, we would appreciate you helping spread the word about Concerned Lay Catholics. Consider sharing about this webinar with someone you know, and add a personal note as to why you think it was important. And finally, we always, and most importantly, appreciate your prayers. One of our Niagara CLC subscribers has told us that she offers 1 decade of her daily rosary for the work of CLC, and that means so much to us. We're a small group of volunteers spread across the country, doing our best to bring intelligent, thoughtful, and reliable information and opinions to our fellow Catholics. If we're not rooted in and supported by prayer, our work will not be successful. And with that thought, I invite you now to join me as I offer the closing prayer. And as this is the week of prayer for Christian unity around the world, I borrowed a prayer from this year's booklet. God, creator and redeemer of all things, teach us to look inward, to be grounded in your loving spirit, so that we may go outward in wisdom and courage, to always choose the path of love and justice. This we pray in the name of your Son, Jesus, and in the unity of the Holy Spirit. Amen. God bless everyone. Hope to see you again at our next webinar or any of our other events, which you can find on our website.